Our next speaker. As I said earlier, today we're going to be celebrating the heroes of the American Revolution, but when I think of this speaker's name, a hero comes to mind from a Jack Schaefer novel. Actually, we don't need that. You don't need the lectern, right? Yeah, we won't need that. Thank you. Anyway, this film and book is called Shane, which is the name of our speaker. Let me give a little bit of his bio. We're going to be hearing about how to argue for a constitution and win every time. Shane Krauser has been called the best instructor of the Constitution in the country. He's a former prosecutor. He's an adjunct professor of constitutional law and director of the American Academy for Constitution Education and a radio talk show host in America. So let us all please welcome Shane Krauser.
All right. You got this going? We good? Test, test. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, I'm not sure about you, but you know, when I read the Constitution, you know, this is a document that comes alive. And I'm really looking forward to having some fun with you today. We're going to talk a little bit this morning going into lunch, and this afternoon we're going to have a lot of dialogue that's going to take place, as well as some debate. We're actually going to take some topics and talk about what those talking points look like. How do we argue the Constitution and win every time? And more importantly, how do we go on the offensive? How do we stop playing defense when it comes to defending liberty? You know, we do that all the time. Those people that believe so strongly in the original intent of the Constitution, we play defense. We wait for accusations to come our way, and then we defend this idea that the accusations are wrong instead of turning the tables and talking about why our ideas are not only better, but justifying that the opponent tell us why their ideas are better at the same time. We want to have that dialogue. So let me pull this up here real quick and get your thoughts here. Well, while they're figuring that out, let me ask you, what would you say is the greatest problem America is dealing with today? What's the greatest problem from your perspective? If we could resolve that issue, we would start to make some serious headway in America. What would that issue be?
Apathy.
Apathy. What do you mean by apathy?
People are so busy with their lives, they just don't care about the Constitution.
Right.
What our liberty and freedoms are.
Right. Apathy. Apathy leads to ignorance. And Thomas Jefferson said that ignorance and freedom cannot coexist. Freedom can only exist if you have a courageous and vigilant people that are willing to stand up and defend the idea. In other words, when you look at human nature, freedom is not the default position. Tyranny is actually the default position because human beings are inclined towards power, and as they access that power, they're inclined towards more power. And how do you access more power? By trampling on the rights of the people. And so when you look at human nature, this Constitution is a document that's designed to resist what human beings are naturally inclined to do. I mean, think about the two pillars of our Constitution. I think we could summarize it rather simply. The two pillars of our Constitution are this: men and women are born free, and men and women with power cannot be trusted. That's our Constitution in a nutshell. And yet, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, we often think about our Constitution being that of telling government, you can do anything you want so long as the Constitution says you can't. That's kind of a perverse reading of the Constitution, and we'll talk about how to rebuff some of those arguments. But I think apathy is one of the greatest problems that we're dealing with today. So, yes?
I think indoctrination of students in public schools and actually public and private schools.
She says indoctrination of our students. You know, we spend a lot of time in high schools, junior high schools, college campuses. We just finished up a 6-day tour in New Mexico where we spoke to over 3,000 public high school students. We're heading out to Montana. We're going to spend 5 days there where we're planning on hitting 3 different high schools with about 3,000 students. I've been teaching in the public system, ASU, Glendale Community College, which is a suburb of the Phoenix area. And one of the first questions that I ask on the first day of each class is, where do our rights come from? Just to get a feeling of where these students are coming from. What do you think is the number one response from these students who have just come out of high school into the college system? Government. 75% or more when initially asked, say that their rights come from government. Where does that come from? We know where it comes from. It's a vicious cycle that's taking place in America today. And when I push them a little bit and say, does that really make sense? So I'm pushing them, I'm not giving them the answer. Their next response is, well, I guess we're in constitutional law, so I guess they come from the Constitution. Wrong again. Wrong. The rights don't come from a piece of paper. And so I push them even more, and their next response is, the people. We get our rights from each other. Wrong again. Wrong again. This is the problem. You start talking about apathy, and you start talking about indoctrination. This is the problem in America today. And so you can imagine being in a college classroom with 90% of your students being liberal. I want you to understand, we're not just going to talk about the problem today, we're going to talk about solutions. And I'm going to share with you my experience on how these solutions are being implemented and why you should have hope for America. Why America's best days are coming if we'll stand up and fight. Because I see students coming into my class, overwhelming majority are liberals. They support Barack Obama. And over the last 4 years as I've been teaching this class, I've seen a significant transition taking place with these students, from going to Obama rallies to going to, say, Ron Paul rallies. Those same people that were supporting Obama at the beginning of the semester are now saying, I got something wrong. There's something that I don't understand. Why wasn't I ever taught these things before? We're just having open dialogue. Why did I never even have an opportunity to talk about these ideas? And so I'm walking out of my classroom last April. And I'm walking out, and a student comes up named Eli, and he says, Mr. Krauser, can I walk with you to the parking lot? I said, sure. He says, I want to ask you a question. I apologize if it's a little bit intrusive. I said, fire away. He says, what party are you affiliated with? I said, I'm a registered Republican. And he says, that's what blows me away. I don't understand. And I said, why don't you understand? He says, well, before I tell you why I don't understand, tell me where you stand on the Second Amendment. And I said, I believe that every citizen, every American, and even beyond that, every human being has a right to defend himself and should have free access to firearms. And he says, that's what I don't get. He says, I wasn't quite sure where you stood given the dialogue that we had in class, but here's the problem. I thought it was Republicans that wanted to take away the firearms from the people. And I said, wait a second, how did you come to this? I'm not kidding you, folks. This was the conversation. I thought it was Republicans who wanted to take away the firearms. And so we're bantering back and forth. And I said, no, actually, that's not the case. And we talked a little bit about the Second Amendment. We talked a little bit about the platform, the Republican Party platform. And most importantly, we talked about the Constitution. I got an email from this individual 2 weeks later saying, thank you so much for that conversation we had in the parking lot. I want to let you know that I've switched my party affiliation. See, but here's what's important here. It's not Republican or Democrat or anything else. This was the first conversation that this 21-year-old kid had ever had with a registered Republican. It was the first conversation. He lived in a lower income neighborhood in the Phoenix area and never had had a conversation with a registered Republican, an intelligent conversation about politics. And I think that's part of the problem, is we're not developing relationships with individuals. They're hearing one set of ideas, and they're never hearing the counter-argument. We're not engaging them. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, relationships. But you're exactly right, this indoctrination. What else would you say is a problem? Yes?
I think the fundamental problem is the misunderstanding of what our Constitution is. We are not a democracy.
Okay.
Nothing about this Constitution or this government is a democracy except the way we vote.
Right.
And that is, I think, the fundamental problem. The liberals, since Teddy Roosevelt, have misrepresented what we stand for.
Right. And you're exactly right. You know, when we go into the schools, I have this conversation with the kids. I'll say, how many of you believe that we live in a democracy? How many hands go up? Almost all of them. And I say, what's a democracy? And they say, well, we the people get to decide what goes on. I said, give me an example of something you get to decide. We get to decide who represents us. I said, give me another example where the people get to decide. And they really couldn't come up with another example. And I said, well, listen, are we the people allowed to go to the ballot box to determine what rights society in general will enjoy? And most of them, gut reaction was, yeah, absolutely. I said, so let's take this. Let's say you live in a community of 1,000 people. and 999 of those people are Catholic, and you have one Buddhist, and the Catholics say, you know what, we want to go to the ballot box, and here's what we're going to vote on. Only Catholicism can be practiced in our city. And I said, is that okay? And almost unanimously, the students get it intuitively. They say, that would be absolutely wrong. And I said, well, that's what a democracy is. Democracy is where a majority get to vote on the rights that the people get to enjoy. So there's got to be a better system. And then I remind them that Thomas Jefferson said that a democracy is the most vile form of government ever known to man. So what is a Republican form of government? Right? A Republican form of government, as we're going to talk about a little later on this afternoon, is designed to protect even the minority. Even the minority. Even the individual that we, the people, say they're detestable. We don't like the message that they communicate. We don't like what they stand for. And I think that's a part of the problem as well in America today, is the unwillingness to stand for the liberties of other people. We're unwilling to stand for liberties that we might ourselves not enjoy or participate in. But the problem is, taking you back to a conversation I had with my 15-year-old boy who was 12 at the time when we had this conversation. Every Sunday night, me and my family have 6 kids. And we have Constitution night every Sunday night. Surprise, surprise, Constitution night. And so I gathered my family around the dinner table and I asked them what they believed was more important, public safety or individual liberty. You want to have a fun conversation? Strike that up with your liberal friends. What do you think is more important, public safety or individual liberty? The overwhelming majority of Americans say public safety is the default position. And you have to remind them that Benjamin Franklin, what do you think about Benjamin Franklin's statement when he said that he that would give up his liberty for security deserves neither? That's a great conversation to have as well. And so I asked my boy who was sitting next to me, my 12-year-old, I said, what's more important? He says, individual liberty is more important. And I said, well, why? He says, Dad, because we've had this conversation before. And I said, well, I want you to articulate for me. Why? And listen to this. This is a 12-year-old boy who gets it. Dad, if you don't stand for individual liberty, first and foremost as a default position, you will ultimately end up being a slave if you don't defend not only your own liberties, but the liberties of other people. And I said, what are you talking about? Because it struck me as a bit odd at first to hear him say, if you don't defend your own liberties and the liberties of others, you will ultimately become a slave yourself. And he says, well, Dad, you travel all across the country talking about Constitution and freedom, and a lot of people don't like your ideas. If you don't defend the liberties of your enemy, at some point, you're next on down the line. They're coming after you next. And so I would encourage us to take the moral high ground, if you will, and that is not just to defend the ideas that we agree with, but to defend the ideas, at least the ability to defend the ideas that we might disagree with. I mean, think about this. The Westboro Baptist Church, right? I find their ideas absolutely contemptible. But how dare any American say you may not speak out as you wish and advocate? I mean, what are the two options? Government force or market force? If the ideas are so bad, let them play out in a society and let the people decide, not government decide. And so we've got to, that's the idea of a Republican form of government as opposed to a democracy. And you're exactly right. The students don't get it. They don't understand it. And even more than that, we live in a society where the general citizenry doesn't get the idea. Nor does the government. You're exactly right, because what are our politicians saying? What are our talking heads saying? Let's spread democracy throughout the world. You do not want to spread democracy throughout the world. What you want to spread throughout the world is freedom. And the issue is, what form of government will best protect freedom? And I believe that our founders really nailed it when they outlined Article 4, Section 4 of our Constitution that said every state is guaranteed a Republican form of government. The problem is that most don't know what it is. It doesn't say battle hymn of the democracy. It's the battle hymn of the republic. You don't pledge allegiance to a democracy. It's to a republic. And then you look at the very words of our founders. What are some other thoughts here? Yes?
The prevalence and dominance of politicians and bureaucrats in every aspect of our lives.
Yes.
And maybe that's stuff they do as a constitutionally.
Yeah.
No.
Yes.
It's absolutely terrible.
Yeah. So I testified in front of U.S. Congress about 9 months ago because my organization, the American Academy for Constitutional Education, we were applying for 501c3 status. And we were locked in a battle for 29 months. And while that battle was going on, I testified. And during my testimony, one of the congressmen chimed in, and he started talking about bureaucracies and how the bureaucracies are a safe haven. And I had to remind him that the bureaucracies are not just a safe haven for the bureaucracies themselves. Bureaucracies are a safe haven. They are a protector for congressmen. So here's what happens. When Congress is sitting there doing nothing and we are complaining to them about certain things going on, who do they blame? They blame the bureaucracies. They said, we didn't do it. The bureaucracies did it. They don't understand that the bureaucracies have literally either stolen power away from them, or the Congress has literally given that power to them unconstitutionally, illegally. So you have 250 bureaucracies that in 2012 created 6,100 regulations, and they're not accountable to the people. That's a problem. What does the Constitution say about legislation? All legislative powers are vested in who? Congress. It doesn't say a few. It doesn't say some, and it doesn't give them permission to delegate them to some bureaucracy. It doesn't give Congress permission to delegate it to the executive. They have no permission to do it. And so you have all of these bureaucracies that have no authority to act constitutionally. They are illegal. And so what you have is a Congress that is hiding behind many of these bureaucracies. They're hiding behind them. It's time for them to go back in and say, you know what, we're taking back the authority that was originally vested into us through the people in order to ensure that we're complying with that oath to the Constitution.
There's no justification at all for executive actions, is there?
So let's talk about that.
All of them. All that.
This is-
Presidents have been doing it from the beginning, but there's no justification.
This is a great point. So her comment here was, there's no justification for executive action. Let me see, did we get this working? Oh, we did? This is the State of the Union speech. Just happened in January of 2014. If you go 8 minutes into the speech, this is where the president says, we've got an issue, I want to work with Congress, but if you will not work with me, I will move unilaterally. What? Yeah, it was a boo. But what was the response? Applause. He got a standing ovation for telling the very individuals that we, the people, had vested legislative power into that he was going to steal it away from them. And they stood up and said, go get them. Isn't that amazing that that's going on in America today? I will issue an executive order if you will not work with me. Now, to this next point, Sheila Jackson Lee. 2 weeks later, what was Sheila Jackson Lee doing? She had put together what is called the Full Employment Caucus. And in this statement, she says it was put together for purposes of facilitating executive orders. That is, we are going to make it easy, and her words were, this is a top priority. It's a top priority to ensure that executive orders are written, and we will facilitate that and allow the president to sign off on these. In other words, we know that it's our job to put forth legislation, but we're not able to do it, so we'll just make short work of this, and we'll just sign these things, put these together, and give them to the president to sign. What does Article 1, Section 1 say? All legislative powers herein granted are vested in Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 1, very simple. And here's what I wrote about it in my book here. Article 1 of the Constitution primarily addresses lawmaking function of the legislative branch. It establishes a few important principles. First and foremost, the legislative branch holds the lawmaking authority because lawmaking is a vested power. It cannot be delegated. All right? And there's also a constitutional process that we learn about in Article 1, Section 6, which talks about how a law moves through the system. She has violated, folks, let's start calling it what it is. She has violated the Constitution that she took an oath to uphold and defend. Not only has she violated the Constitution, she has committed an illegal act. Let's call it what it is. And so when you talk about executive orders, does the president have any power to legislate? No. He has zero. How do we know that? Because this tells us that he has no power to do that. Now, can the president, are there some types of executive orders that are legitimate? Yes. Article 2 outlines the executive branch's authority. And so if he's as the commander-in-chief, he wants to move his troops from point A to point B, can he issue an executive order to do that? Yeah. Absolutely. If he wants to talk about how his administration is going to be run, when people are going to come to work, and how they're going to execute their duties, can he issue an executive order talking about those things? Absolutely he can. He can do anything with respect to an executive order, so long as it pertains to his delegated powers in Article 2 of the Constitution. It's that simple. See, we want to make this much more difficult than it really is. And you know, me being a lawyer, I'm probably the last guy you want to hear about the Constitution from. Why? Because we lawyers are the problem. We make this stuff much more difficult than it really is. Right? You go into a law library and there's stories of these books and these treatises and these legal decisions. We made it so much more difficult than it really is. So when you talk about executive orders, let's understand that there are some legitimate executive orders, but they pertain to his delegated powers. But most of those, anytime the president is trying to move forward with a piece of legislation and bypass Congress, those are fundamentally illegal. What are some other issues? Yes?
A focus from individual rights to categories of individuals.
Yeah. Individual rights versus collective rights. Why have we gone to that point in America? Why do we want to talk about collective liberties as opposed to individual? How have we come to that point?
I think part of it was more of a focus on equality than liberty.
Yeah.
Trying to get each group and looking at the group and then everybody belonging to some type of category.
Right. And I think part of the problem when we look at what's going on today is we fail to read, for example, the Constitution in conjunction with the Declaration of Independence. Listen, if you remove the Declaration of Independence as the underpinning of the Constitution, you can make the Constitution anything you want it to be. The Declaration of Independence is the why. The Constitution is the how. The Declaration of Independence is the promise. The Constitution is the fulfillment of that promise. The Declaration of Independence is what individuals were willing to die for. Individual liberty, small government. The Constitution is what they were willing to live for. That's how these things come together. There's synergy between these two documents, but we want to just neglect the Declaration of Independence if at all possible, because we say Thomas Jefferson, the red-haired wonder, I mean, he was a slave owner. Andy said this a little bit earlier. He alluded to this. The veracity of a statement does not depend on the virtue of a person making it. So when he talked about Hitler, can Hitler speak the truth? Absolutely. Think about this. We've got to start countering these ideas that just because our founding fathers were human beings and they made mistakes like everybody else, that somehow what they said was untrue. If we rolled in 3 individuals through this front door, Hitler, Mao, and Stalin, and they all stood right here in front of you and said, killing is wrong, would they be telling a lie? No, they would be speaking the truth. You might contest their credibility, but you would not say that they were lying to you. And that's what you have to look at when you look at the Founding Fathers. Can you contest their credibility on some issues? Absolutely, they were human beings. But can you deny the truth of the things that they said? That's what we want to debate. See, the other side wants to talk about personalities. They don't want to talk about ideas. And so we've got to get back to really understanding the underpinning of that Constitution, because that Declaration of Independence makes it very clear that it was individual liberty that was being protected. Yes?
I think a big issue is the stifling of dissenting ideas, the intimidation of people who hold those ideas, and the institutionalization of the ideas that are contrary.
Yes.
i.e. the media, academia, there is no forum, and if you speak, you are demonized, intimidated, and stifled. And I'm saying this as a relatively outspoken person who is nonetheless...
I would have never noticed, by the way.
who nonetheless spends most of my time in the closet.
Uh-huh. You know what? Can I tell you this? Is there anyone here that is not living in New York at this time? Well, there's a couple here from North Carolina. Anyone here not living in New York? Where are you living? Virginia. Massachusetts. Anyone else? Let me tell you what, coming from Arizona, very conservative state, I want to tell you before we go any further how much it is that I respect what it is that you people are doing and the fight that you're fighting here. We see, in Arizona, we don't have to hide behind a pseudonym. We don't have to be reluctant about sharing our views. I understand that that's what many of you are dealing with, because you have a livelihood that you have to keep, you have a family that you have to take care of, and on the other hand, you have principles that you strongly believe in. I want you to know that I've spent a lot of time talking about what it is that you're dealing with as I've traveled the country. And especially in Arizona, I've emphasized this over and over and over. And what I continue to hear from the people that come and listen to what it is that we do is tell those New Yorkers that Arizonans stand with them. And I think we need to see more of that. People standing with one another, coming together, and allowing for there to be a vigorous exchange of ideas. Let me just give you an example of what I think a free society looks like. You know, same-sex marriage right now is a hot topic. And it even has divided, to a certain degree, conservatives. And so I'm sitting down with my family during another Constitution night, and they said, Dad, you know, at school, we're talking a lot about this same-sex issue. And he says, Dad, I'm really concerned about how I should respond here. And I said, well, what's your concern? He says, well, I'm not quite sure what government's role is and how I should make that argument, that, you know, as to where government fits. And I said, well, son, think about it this way. We are a family that believes in traditional values. We should not be ashamed of those traditional values. But I want you to think for just a moment, if our next door neighbor was a same-sex couple. Would you have problems with that, Daniel? If it was a same-sex couple? He says, not necessarily. I said, and you shouldn't. See, because in a free society, I say the same-sex couple is living next door. And I'm going to respect the idea that they might think we're right-wing wackos. And they're going to be talking amongst themselves and their own people, saying those people that believe in traditional values are just crazy. And that's okay. They can say those things. But they're going to understand what we believe, that we believe in traditional values and we don't subscribe to their worldview. And you know what, Daniel? We can go out on a Saturday afternoon and we can shake hands and we can have a barbecue and we can sit and watch a football game with them. Even though we might have differences of opinion, have a vigorous exchange of ideas. But we have to come to an agreement. Both sides have to come to an agreement. And the agreement says this: neither one of us will use government force to achieve our agenda. If we could do that, I mean, that's a free society. And so, as a guy who believes in traditional values, I think I would, along with many of you, would be first on the front lines to defend their ability to say those things that they want to say. Even though I might disagree with them, I want to engage in that debate with them. But I want to get away from this idea that every time there's a problem, we've got to use government force to fix the problem. I think we've seen, history tells us what happens every time you use government to fix a problem. We know what that looks like, right? We do. What are some other issues? I saw a few other hands. Yes?
We have the Federal Reserve now, which has become a paper currency, and you got an issue, I think, where the state is to want to give more power to the government like that, because they want to spend money without limit. And you also have people in finance who like that because they can take on high leverage in their business for 20 times leverage.
Yeah.
And they can make a lot of money, they invest that 20x leverage. And so they're supporting the same kind of policies that the state is like. So you've got these two very large and powerful groups kind of opposing a move in a good direction to the amount of currency you can really use for those purposes. So I think the problem is how do you change that? Right? They've got a short-term interest in finance people to keep this thing going as long as they can, and yet it's probably pushing us towards destruction.
Absolutely. And if I could speak to the broader issue of that, I think it's interesting what we're doing in our financial system right now. We continue to incur debt. I want you to think about what we're doing, what our government is doing to us. And I want you to think about it from the perspective of the 13th Amendment. Does anybody know what the 13th Amendment says? Abolish slavery. Think about this debt that's being incurred. And think about it in the context of the 13th Amendment. Involuntary servitude. Who's going to have to pay that debt back? We are. Who else? children, your grandchildren, individuals who aren't even born are going to be responsible for paying back something that they had no input in creating. From my perspective, now you have individuals going to work every day, and a part of that time that's allocated throughout that workday is going to be working to pay back something that our generation incurred. That's involuntary servitude. Let's call it what it is. They're working for something that they had no say-so with. And so we've got a big problem. Thomas Jefferson made it rather clear that a responsible people will clean up the debt that they incurred so the next generation doesn't have to deal with it. We haven't done that. Yes?
Well, then why do we have a Federal Reserve? It's not the Constitution that it's wrong.
That's right, and it's because we've allowed these things to happen. Let's look at the bigger issue here. Why has this happened? Well, because America historically, over the last 100 years, this confined a little bit, over the last 100 years has engaged in a good idea, bad idea analysis. I mean, when was the last time you went to a debate where there were politicians there? Or you went to a forum where individuals were talking about what they'd like to see happen, what would make society better? I can guarantee you that what you heard was a contest of good idea versus bad idea. That's the wrong approach. I don't care if a good idea is good or bad until I first establish that government has the authority to do it in the first place. And so I sat on a panel about 2.5 years ago with 3 doctors, an insurance agent, and there I was. And we were talking about health care. The first 3 doctors got up and they were going back and forth. One doctor said, you know what, we're a compassionate society. This is the direction we need to go. Healthcare is a good idea. And then the 2 other doctors said, if we do this, we're going to Canadian-style medicine, we're going downhill, and we're going downhill fast. And then the great thing about being on a panel like this is when you get to speak last. And so I was the last speaker. So I go last, and I said, you know what, excuse me, but we've been debating for the last hour whether healthcare is a good idea or a bad idea. I'm not here to debate that. All I want to know and all I want to debate first and foremost is whether or not government even has the authority to do it in the first place. Nobody wants to have that debate right now. So, and you notice, listen, I know that those of you that have been around and you're involved in these political circles, you say, well, of course. Well, understand that it's the other side that doesn't want to have that debate. Do you remember when Nancy Pelosi was asked the question? She said, are you serious? Are you serious? That question was so foreign to her, it came out of left field. She had no idea. For her to conceive that it couldn't possibly be in line with the rule of law, she just couldn't conceive that in her own mind. And so it struck her as odd. And I've got another clip. We still don't have audio working, do we? Darn. Do you all remember out of Illinois, Congressman Phil Hare? Congressman Phil Hare is involved in a conversation and he's surrounded by bloggers. And at one point, one of the bloggers says, where in the Constitution do you have the authority? And he's looking at these bloggers and the question comes from over here. And he looks over for just a moment and he says, quite frankly, I don't care about the Constitution when it comes to this, and moves right here, right back. And the guy calls him out again. And he says, quite frankly, what I care about is the individual pursuit of happiness. That's what it talks about. So on the one hand, he doesn't care about the Constitution, and on the other, he wants to start quoting the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, later on in the conversation, he said the pursuit of happiness was found in the Constitution. So this is a guy that doesn't even know what's there. But that's part of the problem, right? Not recognizing what's even in the parameters of the document, but also a disregard, an absolute disregard by these individuals in government for that document. What are some other thoughts here? Yes?
I actually think sort of the threat of foreign aggressors with Al-Qaeda and now ISIS on the loose.
Yes.
I think that's a big threat to America right now.
Yeah, foreign aggressors. Now let's talk about this because now we're talking about airstrikes. I want you to put emotion aside for a moment. There's a lot of evil going on over in the Middle East right now. But in order for this president to act, what must happen? Have you heard anybody talk about this? I haven't heard anybody, and I've tried to pay attention to what's going on here. And listen, are there any congressmen that are standing up and crying out that the president needs to confer with us, with Congress first? Do you remember Joe Biden back when George Bush was president? I've got the clip here. He says, if this president chooses to act unilaterally and go to war, I will move to impeach him immediately. And yet when our president moves to act militarily and does it unilaterally without conferring with Congress, it's not a big deal. Nobody has the conversation. I mean, but what does the Constitution say about this? Yeah, take a look at Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress shall declare war. And until they declare war, can the president act militarily? The answer is no, with a few exceptions. I mean, if we're being attacked right now, that's one thing. But to deliberate about whether or not we're going to engage, that's something for a congressional body to take care of. We don't want one man taking our young men and women and putting them on the front lines. And the founders talked about this over and over and over, not only during the convention, but you can read about it in the Federalist Papers as well. It was James Madison who said that the Constitution supposes what the history of governments demonstrate, that the executive is the individual who is most inclined to war. Therefore, we have delegated authority to deciding whether or not we will go to war to who? Congress. A deliberative body of 535 individuals today. Not one man, 535 individuals, where we're going to have a contest of ideas to decide whether or not this is the appropriate decision. Now, if you remember, a year ago, we were contemplating going into Syria, and the president stood up and said, this is the red line. And apparently the red line was crossed. And he says, they've crossed the red line, we're going. And then 2 days later says, we're going to confer with Congress. I was in Kansas City at the time. That morning, I was watching Fox News, and they had a conservative congressman from Arizona on TV. And they asked him about the president coming back to them and conferring. And he said this, I have no idea why the president is coming to confer with us. Yes, this happened, folks. I mean, this sort of stuff shouldn't surprise us. He had no idea why the president was now coming to him to decide whether or not war or military action was appropriate. Amazing. These individuals have no concept of what it is that they're supposed to do. Why? Why? It goes back to what you said, apathy. Apathy. When you have a citizenry that does not understand the Constitution, when you have a citizenry that doesn't understand what it means to be free, you in turn will elect individuals that don't understand those concepts either. Understand that what's going on in Washington, D.C., your local government in New York City, state government in New York, is a direct reflection of the people. It's a direct reflection of the people. When the citizenry are uneducated, we tend to vote in individuals that are uneducated on the principles that we deem to be most important. Nasty, vicious, ugly cycle. Other thoughts here? Yes?
What about your thoughts on Christmas and it being a national holiday, federal holiday, and does that violate the separation of church and state?
No. No, I don't have an issue with that, and I love to talk about this idea of church and state as well, First Amendment. But I don't see this as being something that violates the First Amendment Establishment Clause. I don't see.
Yes. So what about if the Muslims want to come here now and they want a national holiday, or the Jewish people want a national holiday?
Yeah. And from my perspective, I side with how the courts decided this particular issue. They articulate this concept by using this term, ceremonial deism. That is, there are some concepts that have been really infiltrated or been an intricate part of our society for so long that no reasonable person would assume that religion, Christianity, and government are one and the same. So think about this. You talked about Christmas. Think about the case that was rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court just recently. State of Utah put up 12 crosses that were, 15 feet high. They put up, and they were on the side of these public highways. And the reason why they put up the crosses was to be a memory. They were a memoriam, if you will, for individuals that had worked as law enforcement officers that had died in the line of duty. And this goes up through the appellate courts, and the appellate courts say that is a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court says we're not going to hear it. Justice Thomas, who, by the way, is my favorite justice. You want to talk about natural law? This is a guy who gets it. He articulates it quite frequently in his opinion. And he goes right to your point. He says, the appellate courts want us to believe that when an individual is driving down the street and sees those crosses on the side of the road, that they automatically conclude that government and religion are one and the same. As you look at the history of the cross and how it's played out in America, does one automatically assume religion? It may have religious roots, but does one automatically assume religion? Not in our day. When you see a cross on the side of the road, what are you thinking about? Somebody died and respect is being paid. You don't put up just a stick. You don't put up a poster. You put up a cross because that has historical meaning, that we're reverencing someone that has just passed. And so when I think you look at some of these issues that are going on in America today, and we say, oh, violation of separation of church and state, I think it's important to understand what was originally intended. And this afternoon, we're going to get into some of that as well. Yes?
But there is nothing about separation of church and state in the Constitution. It just says the state will not establish a religion.
Right.
And this is absurd.
Do you know where the term, you're right, the term separation of church and state is not found in the Constitution. Where does that term come from? Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wrote this. It was a letter that he had written to the Danbury Baptists in 1803. They were so concerned that government was going to infringe on their ability to practice a religion, and it was Thomas Jefferson who wrote a letter back to them, consoling them, saying there's a separation of church and state, meaning government has to hold the line. Their obligation is to protect you from from ensuring that other individuals or the government themselves does not infringe. Don't worry about government and religion becoming one and the same. And so we perverted that, and certainly the courts have perverted that, not looking at the original context of that statement. Other thoughts here? Yes?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to put this exactly, but I thought about it a lot. Seems to me that there is an enormous struggle in this country right now that is the key to where we'll go in the future, and that is between those who believe, and a lot of them are in the government, but some of them are private, and many of them are the citizens, that the government has the answers to every problem in life, and that they are the ones who are going to improve the quality of life for each individual. The government has the answer versus those who believe in the founders and the central issue of individual rights being the key, and which leads us to a constitutional republic. And this struggle is ripping this country apart. I get very angry when I see people say, oh, let's have the Congress people and the people in Congress have bipartisan talks. Some issues, if you're coming from a different place, you're actually in a different world. You can't have that conversation. You can be civil, but you have to find a place where you can have a discussion, an argument. And if you have individual rights on one side and the government can find all the solutions on the other side, you have a gulf that cannot be bridged. Now, I don't know how you, some of the things, education, et cetera, gets to this, but I know this problem has to be solved in order for this country to survive as a constitutional republic.
A couple of things. Number one, just because the problem is not being fixed overnight, don't throw in the towel. Don't throw in, I'm not suggesting that you are, but many people do. They say government's so far out of hand, we can never fix this thing. I want to provide some context. From 1760 until about 1781, the founders are fighting for this idea of individual liberty and respect for the rule of law. Right? That's what they're fighting for. It starts in 1765 with the Stamp Act, and then it follows for the next 10 years, and then they engage in war. Imagine if the founders had said, man, if they come back the next time with something in addition to the Stamp Act, we're done. And then they come down with the Townsend Act. Oh, if they do something more, we're done, guys, it's over. And then they come down with the Tea Act. Oh, if they do anything more, again, I don't think that was the perspective. So think about, to really get things back on track, took them about 20 years. But then think in the history of this country what happened. As you look at women's rights and the ability to vote, go from 1788 when the Constitution was ratified until 1919. That's 130 years. That battle was fought over 130 years, if you will. It took time. It takes time to fight these battles. Look at the issue of slavery. 1788 till 1865, 77 years. It took time. Look at the issue of civil rights, allowing blacks to have the same rights as the white man here. You go from 1788 to 1965, 177 years. What I'm suggesting to you is we're involved in an experiment. It's an experiment. And as you look at America, it's a constant upward spiral with some ebbs and flows towards more freedom and less government. Right now, we're involved in a phase where government has become overwhelming. Right? They're encroaching on every area of our lives. But listen, this is how you change America right here. You're in a huge city, I understand, but it's groups like this that change things. No movement towards more freedom and less government has come about by way of government implementing something. Every movement that has ever taken place in America and throughout the history of the world has always started with grassroots. It's always started with small groups of people like this saying, enough is enough. Think about that. Anytime you've experienced more freedom, the civil rights movement didn't happen because government stood up. Right? It happened because people took to the streets. Women's rights didn't happen because government just stood up. It happened because women stood up and said no more. And that's the same thing with us. This is how it's going to happen. This is how you're going to start to chip away at it. But I get the problem, too, that you're talking about. Think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court, also known as Darth Vader Ginsburg. All right, so do you remember, this was back in 2012. Egypt has an issue, and they're looking for a constitution, and Justice Ginsburg is interviewed. And what did she say about our Constitution? Not to use it. She says, if I were advising Egypt, I would advise them not to look to our Constitution because why? It's too old. It's too old. That's the reason. So with longevity, the truth apparently wears out. I don't know how that goes. But she says it's too old. And then when she's asked, what Constitution would you look to? Do you remember what Constitution she would look to? South African Constitution. Has anybody read the South African Constitution? Guess what? In our Constitution night, we did. We read the South African Constitution. I went to their equivalent of the Bill of Rights. And it says, the individual shall have the right to food, water, housing, health care. And my son, 9 years old at the time, chimes in. He says, Dad, who's going to pay for that? See, we don't see beyond tomorrow. We just say those are great ideas, but that's the status thing that you're talking about, is that cradle-to-grave security is better. But we know that the statist philosophy has not made this country the most prosperous country the world has ever seen. It didn't come about by those philosophies. It was something different. It was a relatively novel idea that took place here, that took root in America. So let me give you an overview. This was just a brainstorming session. When we come back after lunch, we're going to get down and dirty. I want to show you how to go on the offensive. I've got some information I'm going to be sharing with you later on as well about how to go on the offensive, what type of sound bites you can use. Somebody accuses you of being a racist. How do you respond to that? Somebody accuses you of, pro-choice and you hate women. How do you respond to that? Okay. Somebody accuses you of, embracing socialism, or that capitalism is an evil idea. How do you respond to that? That's what we're going to go through. And tonight, for the last hour, we're actually doing a debate where you're leading the debate. Let me give you just a heads up here before we break for lunch. We got 5 minutes, so I'll close it out with this before we go. After we, from 4:45 to 6, we're going to have a series of 4 debates. And these debates, I'm going to give you a topic, and you're going to be working in a group. And your group is going to come up here, and you're going to make the argument to the audience. And the audience is going to be permitted to ask you questions. Okay? And this is not designed to tear the individual apart. What I want to do here is refine our arguments. How do we refine the argument? How do we go out and be effective? And some of these are topics that you've certainly seen before, but if we understand the underlying argument here, I think we'll be more effective. So if your last name begins with A through G, you are going to be debating. You're not debating, you're going to be advocating a position. Whether you agree with it or not, you're going to advocate this position. Flag burning is protected speech. Flag burning is protected speech. It is free speech. Okay? If your last name begins with A through G, will you raise your hand and kind of look around to other individuals? Here's what I'd like to do. If you stay here for lunch and you want to meet with one another, A through G will meet in that back corner over there. If you want to mingle and talk about some of these ideas and what you want to talk about, this is going to be a lot of fun. So A through G will be back there. H through N. If your last name begins with H through N, will you raise your hand? And you guys will meet back in that corner. And here's the issue that you're going to be arguing. Healthcare is not a right. Healthcare is not a right. How do we articulate that? Let's talk about that, because I know that's a big issue. I know that's a big issue. Here's the next one, O through T. If your last name is O through T, will you raise your hand and look around? Okay, O through T. You can meet up here. And here's what you're going to be arguing. Cameras on the streets don't make us safer and are a violation of our rights. Cameras on the streets do not make us safer and are a violation of our rights. Look at that through the lens of the Fourth Amendment. And U through Z. Do we have any U through Z? I hope. Okay, we do have a few. This is actually my favorite. Businesses have a right to discriminate if they're asked to do something that would violate the owner's religious beliefs. Okay? It's essentially a Hobby Lobby type case. Corporations. So those are going to be the 4 issues we're going to debate at the end of the day. And let's say U through Z if you want to just congregate up in this area. But what we're going to be doing this afternoon before the debate is I'm going to show you what one-liners look like, how you utilize these things, and how you go on the offensive and stop playing defense. So here's my concern as you go to lunch. We talked about a lot of stuff just brainstorming here. And I know, because it's by design, I'm trying to create some tension in your mind, maybe even a little bit of confusion, because we hit on a lot of topics. I always think back when I do this experiment to the gold rush in the 1850s. Do you know when they went back for the gold rush to California, they were ready to build serious wealth. What did they find on the gold when they arrived? Blue stuff. And they said, we don't know how to process the blue stuff to get to the gold, we're out of here. And you had people leaving because they didn't know how to process the blue stuff. What was the blue stuff? Silver. It was silver. And so all I'm suggesting is we've got to process the silver. We've got to get down and dirty a little bit before we get to gold. And the gold is restoration. But we've got to understand first how to deal with those people who don't understand what principles America was founded upon. So I'm looking forward to this afternoon. We're going to have a lot of fun. Thank you all so much.